Chapter 4. His dead brothers watched him. The two Rubricae were silent and still. Charred flakes of debris drifted down to cover the red of their armor. The light in their eyes had dimmed to pale green in their helms. Ahriman watched them as he stood, waiting for a movement, for a sign of awareness. There was none. He could hear the spirits trapped inside the armor, confused and half blind, searching for direction. Without Tolbek to guide them, they were little more than statues. He glanced around the chamber. Fresh blood was still seeping from heaps of hacked flesh and armor. The battle with Tolbek and the slaughter of Jezreel and his vassals had taken fewer than 5 beats of a human heart. He needed to make decisions and make them quickly. There were at least 100 more of the harrowing on the Titan Child, and many more on the Blood Crescent. It would not be long before they discovered what had happened to their lord, and when they did... There was also Tolbek's ship hanging close in the void, its crew waiting for their master's word. The pain in Ahriman's head was growing, and his muscles were shivering with the after-effects of the vision. He tried to focus. The memory of what he had seen and heard boiled through his thoughts. He pulled his helmet off and spat a goblet of blood and bile onto the floor. The air tasted of corruption, charred meat, and exposed guts. He was alone on a ship of enemies with more enemies waiting in the void. He was exhausted, his mind and spirit drained. The only advantage he had was that no one knew what had happened here. Not yet. A low gurgling and a gasp made him turn. Ahriman tensed, suddenly aware of another living presence in the chamber. It was close to the tangle of armored corpses heaped over the throne. He moved closer, trying to ready his exhausted mind. When he was a step away from the throne, he saw the figure and remembered that he had not killed every member of the harrowing in the chamber. Maroth lay curled on the floor behind the throne. His face was streaked with tracks of blood that had run from his eyes. He had drawn his legs up under him, his gauntleted hands clasped to his chest. Ahriman stepped closer, and Maroth's head twitched up. A blood-rimmed eye met Ahriman's gaze, and Maroth let out a hissing yelp. Ahriman did not need to read the sorcerer's tattered aura to tell that something had snapped inside him, and what remained was fractured and broken. Space Marines were creatures made from men but forged to be weapons. They were made to endure in mind and body what mortal men could not, but Maroth had cut away at that strength, selling himself for petty power and lies. He had sacrificed too much and not understood what he had given. Ahriman's invasion of Maroth's mind had snapped what strength remained, and he felt brief pity at what this demigod warrior had allowed himself to become. Then he remembered the creature held in one of the Titan Child's cold vaults, in the empty pit of Astrios' eye. He raised his hand, gathering strains of emotion to his will. Crackling blue light arced around his fingers. It would be a kindness. The power built, and he remembered the raven's laughter, and the vision the battle had induced in his mind. He hesitated. Maroth snarled, but Ahriman could see the fear in the broken sorcerer's eyes. The energy crackled to nothing on Ahriman's fingers. Maroth's wide eyes blinked, and he began to shake. After a second, the shake became a low, gurgling chuckle. "Get up," said Ahriman quietly. Maroth continued to laugh from the floor. Ahriman lifted his hand and extended a fraction of his will. Tolbek's sigil-etched sword leapt from the floor to his hand. He caught it, and suddenly its point was at Maroth's neck. The last sorcerer of the harrowing went still, the choked-off laugh spluttering in his throat. "You do not want to die," said Ahriman. "Now stand, or I will take your eyes and give you to your nightmares." Maroth stood, somehow looking withered and hunched despite his armor. He kept his blood-rimmed eyes on Ahriman. "I can keep my eyes," he said, and there was a tremble of madness in the words. "I will not take them, and you will live," said Ahriman. He glanced towards the immobile Rubricae and the sealed doors to the chamber. "But now you will follow me and do as I command." Maroth looked as if he were about to sneer, as if a fragment of his pride had surfaced in his mind. Then he met Ahriman's gaze again, and gave a smile that showed his filed teeth. They were pink with blood. "Where are we going?" Maroth hesitated, and his tongue flicked across his teeth. "Master." "I am not your master," said Ahriman, walking towards the chamber doors. "And we are going to take this ship." They moved quickly through the Titan Child. Ahriman walked behind Maroth so that anyone looking would see him in his normal place. Maroth twitched and murmured as he walked, and Ahriman had to growl threats into his mind so that he moved with his usual imperiousness when they passed others of the harrowing. Fatigue pulsed at Ahriman's temples whenever he psychically nudged Maroth. He glanced at the soothsayer as they passed through an access hatch into a deserted tunnel. Maroth had started to drool, his spit flecked with green fluid. Ahriman quickened his pace and pushed Maroth in front of him. He wondered whether anyone would think to enter the throne room. Most would be too terrified of displeasing Jezreel, but someone might wonder why Maroth walked the decks, but his master was nowhere to be seen. Every moment made discovery by the rest of the harrowing more likely, and when they did uncover what had happened, there would be carnage. Some of the harrowing would assume that Maroth had decided to oust Jezreel and try to revenge their dead lord. Others would assume the same, but see the opportunity to seize power themselves. Factions would form in seconds, and the blood would flow. Ahriman had seen it happen in many warbands. If Jezreel had died at any other time, Ahriman doubted that any of the harrowing would have survived at all. They slowed when they reached the compartment of the ship Jezreel had made his gaol. The corridors and small rooms already reeked of feces, open flesh, and fear. There the harrowing, and a clutch of hunched mutant slave masters, stood close to the sealed glass doors. Ahriman barked telepathic orders at Maroth, and he approached them with his usual air of contempt. Ahriman followed, Tolbek's sword held loose in his hand. The harrowing growled words of respect, and the slaves abased themselves as they passed. At the entrance to the cells another of the harrowing stood. Hagos was his name, remembered Ahriman. He was massively built, and his chain axe rested at his feet, its motor silent. Unhelmed, Ahriman could see the chewed and twisted flesh of Hagos's head. He had lost half of it to a rival's teeth. He watched them come, and Ahriman could sense the caution in the gaze. Uncomplicated, reliable, and brutally disciplined, Hagos was the only one Jezreel had trusted to guard this door. He was also mute, and had a mind like a lump of iron. Ahriman felt Maroth's mind jump suddenly, and the soothsayer staggered, a high-pitched whine escaping his lips. Ahriman went still. By the door, Hagos had brought his chain-axe up. The weapon's teeth remained motionless. Ahriman had no choice. He reached his mind out and enveloped Maroth's crippled psyche. The effort made lights dance in front of his eyes, and he had to fight down sharp pain. He straightened Maroth, pulling his mouth open and breathing words into his mind. "Do you dare threaten me?" spat Maroth, and pointed to Hagos's collapsed lump of a face. "I will flay the skin from you, and feed the rest to the nether creatures of the warp." Hagos lowered his chain-axe. Ahriman made Maroth spit at Hagos's feet, and the guard bowed his head as they passed through the sealed hatch. The chamber stank. Without his helmet, Ahriman could taste the congealing blood and stagnant air. Astrios looked up as they entered, and the pupil of his remaining eye narrowed to a pinprick of hate as he saw Maroth. Ahriman heard the hatch seal behind him and let go of his hold on Maroth's mind. The soothsayer slumped to the floor and began to mule and twitch. Ahriman felt a wave of nausea and fatigue bubble up as he broke the link. There was a sweat on his skin, and he had to take a deliberate breath to balance his thoughts. Astrios was looking at him, his expression stony and his mind a caution-clad fortress. "I can free you," said Ahriman. Astrios was silent, his eyes still fixed on Ahriman as if weighing the possibility of the offer being true. "How?" "The leaders of the harrowing are dead," said Ahriman, and saw Astrios' eye flare with surprise. "At whose hand?" "Mine," said Ahriman. Astrios shook his head, the chains holding him clinking at the movement. "You did not do that to free me." "No," Ahriman held Astrios' gaze, "but I will free you." "To what end?" growled Astrios, and there was laughter in his voice. "To be another lord's pet? To be yours?" "To save yourself and your brothers," said Ahriman. And he watched Astrios' aura flare and churn with conflicting emotion. He hoped he had the measure of the renegade librarian, and that this gambit would work. If it did not... "But what is the price, Horkos?" snarled Astrios, loading Ahriman's false name with contempt. "You will give me your oath, and follow my word," said Ahriman levelly. Astrios did laugh at that, a full snarling laugh that hacked from his lungs and shook the chains. "You say you have slain your masters, so you will have few allies in less time. I need this ship, and the harrowing on board must die. For that I need you and your brothers." Ahriman could see Astrios struggling to contain warring instincts. "I can give you more," he said, and paused. I can give you vengeance. Astrios gave him a long, hard look. My oath and the oaths of my brothers are not goods to be bartered for. Ahriman nodded slowly. He had thought it might come to this, that he would have to take this step. He did not want to. Astrios' loyalty and defiance were qualities he admired, but there was no choice. Very well. Ahriman raised Tolbek's sword. He could feel the crystal at its core sing in tune with his mind. A thought drove cold light down the blade's edge. He raised the sword and Astrios followed with his eye, defiance hardening his face to pale stone in the sword's light. Ahriman cut, the movement in his mind flowing as one. Astrios fell to the floor. Maroth yelped from the corner at the sound of shearing metal. Now you are free, said Ahriman, looking down at the figure at his feet. Curse you, whispered Astrios, anger making his voice shake. He remained on the floor, kneeling, with the remains of his chains hanging from his wrists. Curse you to the end of all things. Ahriman nodded, swallowing a breath. The sword's glow reflected from his eyes, and he turned towards the hatch. Come, he said quietly. I need your repayment for the life I give you. Astrios did not move. He was breathing hard, and Ahriman could feel the librarian struggling to contain his rage. You have my oath, sorcerer, but give me one thing in return for its theft. Astrios looked up. What is your name? My name is Azek Ahriman. Astrios nodded, without emotion or recognition. We will need the ship's mistress. If this insanity is to work, we need her, said Astrios, and turned back to Maroth. The soothsayer was a hunched in fetal shape, clad in armor and tanned skin. Maroth's jaw twitched as if he were going to speak, but he said nothing, his black eyes jumping at every movement. You can have him, said Ahriman, glancing from Astrios to Maroth. You may not demand vengeance, but I give it to you. Astrios got to his feet and flexed the scabbed skin of his healing hands. No, you said I would live, yelled Maroth as Astrios stepped forwards. I did. You will live, and I will not take your eyes. Ahriman looked at Astrios. Maroth went still, and then smiled up at Astrios' shadow fell over him. Your eye tasted of the dung you are, and those of your brothers too, hissed Maroth and licked his teeth. You are a brotherhood of the half-blind. He laughed. Astrios' sudden rage filled the room. He bent down, his bare hands reaching for Maroth's head. Ahriman turned to the door. He closed his eyes briefly, seeing the raven soaring against the red sun, and the robed figure looking down on a legion that was less than dust. He had hoped for so long that it would fade to a memory and then to nothing. Perhaps he had kept himself alive to live that punishment. Now he had chosen a different path. Someone was hunting him, and fate had him in its claw. He had to know who and why. There were choices and possibilities ahead of him. He saw that even through the demon's lies. If you do not tread those paths, others will, the demon had said. Demons lied, but he felt the truth of those words as if he had always believed them. There was no choice. He opened his eyes and pushed his wheel into Tolbek's blade again. He rapped on the hatch and cut down into the space beyond as it opened. Behind him, Maroth screamed. Carmenta stopped in the darkness and let the silence surround her. Slowly she extended a hand and placed it against one of the pipes that ran along the narrow passage wall. The pipe vibrated under the brass of her fingers. Hush, she thought. I will find a way to return soon. I will. I promise. She had been so close to linking with the ship when they took her. So close. Another second and she could have purged them from her and reduced their ship to molten wreckage. Instead, she had watched as the harrowing tried to claim her ship. They had turned the decks and holds into entrail-littered caves, filled with smoke and the cries of the dying. Their feral engine-seers swarmed through her ship's innards like rats. But for all their defilement, they had not succeeded in awakening the Titan child. The ship remained silent, its systems sleeping. Carmenta felt a brief sensation that might have been the memory of a smile. It would never waken for them, not without her, and they had yet to realize that fact. The harrowing had forged the sleeve collar around her neck, but it accepted that she simply maintained the ship for Astrios and his brothers. If they considered her at all, it was only as a creature whose knowledge of their new prize might be useful. She was grateful for their stupidity. They had had the wit to seal and guard the bridge, though. The clinking of metal on metal broke her thought. She looked around and then realized that her brass hand was shaking, the fingers rattling on the metal pipe. She snatched her hand away. The shaking was getting worse with every passing hour. A squall of angry data blinked across her vision. She still had a link to the ship in a sense, a thin thread of crude data fed directly to her implants. Through this link, she could feel the slow dreams of the Titan child and feel its pain. Every crude attempt by the Harrowing to wake the ship had sent pain stabbing through her body. At first, that connection had been comforting, but now it seemed only to make the lack of true connection worse. It was enough for her to share its pain, but not enough to soothe it. She was also not certain how clearly her mind was working. Bright light bloomed in her skull. She stopped and steadied herself against the wall. She could not focus her thoughts. For a split second she panicked, her mind and memory suddenly a blank void. Then processes of sensation and thought returned. She looked around herself. She was standing in a narrow, pipe-lined corridor. Behind her cracked mask, her face was aching. She wondered whether it was the ghostly sensation of a smile, but she could not remember why. She reached a hand out to the wall of the passage. The metal was quiet under her touch, and then shivered as if somewhere a system protested. For a second she had a sense that she had done this before, but she could not remember, and it did not matter. All that mattered was that someone was hurting her. Again the metal vibrated under the touch of her fingers. "They will die," she thought. "All of them, I promise." "Mistress Carmenta," the voice crackled into her ear. She went still. The voice had spoken directly to her using the Vox system implanted into her cranium. The ciphers for that system were known by very few. She registered and identified the voice. It was Astrios, but that made no sense. The Harrowing had him chained in a cell, and his brothers with him. "Astrios," she said, the word passing from mind to Vox without leaving her lips. For a second she wondered if his voice was real, or just a ghost of sound caught in her memory. Static hissed in her head, and then the reply came. "We are free, and we will take back the ship." Silence and static returned, and then she heard laughter ringing over the Vox and down the passage. It took another beat of her machine heart to realize that the laughter was hers. They took the ship by murder rather than battle. The Harrowing were scattered through the Titan child, and they took those they found by swift bloodletting. They worked through the dark, Phidias and Caden moving ahead of Ahriman and Astrios. They had taken armor and weapons from the Harrowing after Ahriman and Astrios had silenced the guards. The armor was mismatched, poorly maintained, and stank, but it worked. At a glance they were Harrowing initiates, but it was a disguise that would never stand more than one look. Just by looking at them, Ahriman could tell the difference. Astrios, Caden, and Phidias might look like Harrowing, but they did not move like them. There was a ragged intensity in every Harrowing gesture, as if every twitch were a suppressed blow. Astrios and his brothers moved with precise discipline. Every turn and gesture formed from practice and focus. When they encountered Harrowing or their slaves, Ahriman would whisper confusion into their minds. Phidias, Caden, and Astrios would then come out of the shadows, moving like wolves running silent towards prey. The damage done to their bodies was still healing, but it took away none of their killing edge. They slew with combat knives, ramming the points through neck joints down into the chest or through eye sockets. Blood would splutter from the wounds as the trio pulled the convulsing corpses into the shadows. The three one-eyed brothers said nothing all the while, but Ahriman noticed that they paused for a second to scoop out the eyes of every Harrowing they killed. 12 Harrowing and 6 slave masters had died that way by the time they reached the antechamber to the Titan Child's bridge. Scorches from Ahriman's banishment of the demon still marked the brass-inlaid floor. There were 5 Harrowing pacing in front of the high arched doors. Ahriman knew them. Like the Galar Hagos, they were mute, their flesh chewed by scars and their minds of dull iron. Jezreel had never trusted most of his followers, and the mute brutes were the only ones he allowed to guard what he valued. Ahriman mused briefly that Jezreel's arrogance had meant that he had never extended that guard to his own life. Ahriman stepped towards the guards. The space in front of the doors to the bridge was a semicircle of black metal that crawled with spiraling patterns inlaid in brass. Its ceiling arched to a shadow dome of armor cries. The stars beyond glowed dimly alongside the dirty light of the great eye, its shape and color a curdling whirl against black. In the dim light the guards took a moment to see Ahriman. He had Tolbek's sword in his hand, its crystal core quiet, but his mind and body ready. Fatigue pulsed through him, but he had used the time since breaking Astrios from the cells to pull himself into a state of calm focus. He would pay later, he knew, but only if they survived. The guards turned to look at him. Ahriman kept walking. One of the guards must have sensed something was wrong because the chainsword in his hands growled to life. Ahriman could see doubt and brute instinct flicker amongst the guards' minds. They began to move, closing to the side and behind him. He formed a thought. Let him multiply and take form in the ether. After years of denying such power, it almost made him lightheaded. "Open the doors," he said quietly. The head of the mute guard directly in front of him twitched in what might have been a denial. The sound of revving chain blades filled the air. He felt time slow as if it were his own heartbeat. His mind was like mirror still water. He breathed out, and, with that breath, the sword lit in his hand. The first blow came from the front, an overhead cut with a chain axe aimed at Ahriman's head. It was fast, but nowhere close to fast enough. Ahriman pivoted to the side. The chain teeth roared within an inch of his face. The tip of Ahriman's sword punched through the guard's neck. Bright red blood spat from the wound as he pulled the sword free to meet the next blow. He could see the fight unfolding in front of him, a net of possibilities, and his own movements meshed perfectly together. The sword in Ahriman's hand shook as it met the turning teeth of a chain sword. He willed fury into the sword's core, and felt the chain sword shear in two. He stepped and turned, slicing low to cut the leg from beneath one guard. A broad-headed axe hacked at his head, but he was already moving. He did not need to see his enemies. He had watched every movement already. He kicked backwards and felt his foot slam into a chest that he knew would be there. He cut to his left. The sword shuddered as it ended a life. A shape moved in front of him, the muzzle of a pistol rising. He took a step forwards and cut off the hand holding the weapon, turned back, and rammed the point of the blade into the groin of a guard rising from the floor. He cut again, blind but still finding a joint in the armor. He stepped to his right, and a blow missed him, and he gave a backhanded cut that parted a skull to red ruin, and the web strands of the future dissolved into the present. For a second he felt nothing, and then his hand began to shake. He blinked, and the chamber drifted back into focus. He was kneeling. On the ground around him the dead lay still. Astrios was walking towards him, unease dancing in his eyes. "We need the tech witch now," said Ahriman between deep breaths. "Will she come?" "She is here already," said Carmenta. It was like returning to the embrace of the mother she had never known. The cradle of cables snaked around her and lifted her from the deck of the bridge. Her awareness of her body faded. Mind links opened her to the systems of her ship. She was dimly aware of gasping as the beat of the plasma reactors became her own, as her skin became asteroid-pitted iron, her gaze the sweep of sensors through the void. Her mind and instinct briefly rebelled, fighting the alien instincts and sensations of the Titan child. Then they were one, the ship and its mistress, their wills and senses bound together. It was like dying and coming to life, like plunging into ice water only to find you could breathe. You were not supposed to control a starship like this. Its spirit was too large and too powerful, the intellect of a controller too weak to do anything but break in the grasp of such a machine. Blasphemy, they had called it, the crowning sin in a life of sins. To Carmenta, it was the most precious thing she had ever known. She felt the familiar touch of servitor feedback and the grumble of waking systems. The background hum of countless signals filled her thoughts. She saw her corridors, chambers, and launch bays through 1,000 machine eyes. Looking out through picked capture lenses, she saw the bridge around her, the tiered banks of servitors and cogitators wrapped in red-tinged shadow. She saw the one she had called Horkos, standing and looking up at the knotted cradle of cables that held her body. Her human body, at least. He was a creature of lies. She flicked between views of his face, emotionless, smooth-skinned, and bright-eyed. He was dangerous and a liar. Astrios called him Ahriman, and he was not the weakling she had thought. She had watched him kill 5 harrowing in a handful of seconds. As if he could hear what she thought, he tilted his head. But of course he could not hear her thoughts. He was a thing of flesh, and she was a goddess of iron. She refocused on preparing herself, cleaving off parts of her mind to ready her systems. Slowly, the output of her reactors began to rise. Power flushed into her field generators. She was nearly ready, and then she would be truly free. She watched the other 2 ships hanging close to her in the void. Their shackled spirits made her want to weep in sympathy and laugh in contempt. The Blood Crescent was a dying wolf, its insides rotting, its spirit reduced to base instincts. The ship that had brought the emissary was a blade-like presence. Its weapons and engines were already armed, she noticed. A blunt statement and challenge, so obvious, so arrogant. She spread her consciousness through her systems, preparing dozens of subtle and gross actions. There was one final matter to address. Egeon, she said in a voice that was a pulse of data. Egeon, awake. It is time again. Within the sensations of data that she felt another psyche unfold. It was not her, but it connected to her, brushing her thoughts like a hand touching hers. I dreamed, mistress, came the reply. To her, the voice sounded like the boom of ocean waves against cliffs. I dreamed we were becalmed and taken by enemies. I dreamed of blood and death and fire across the stars. It was no dream, and now we must flee, she said. Flight again, came the voice, and it was fainter as if already tired of speaking. Yes, and you must guide me again. She could not see Egeon as they spoke. There were no sensors or picked eyes in his tower, but she could imagine him as she had last seen him. A stretched body of gray flesh, suspended in a lattice of brass tubes feeding his failing flesh. He had no true eyes anymore, and a tube filled his mouth and plunged it down his throat. He dreamed more and more, his sense of time and place failing every time she woke him. He was her navigator, however, and he had never failed her before. He had led her through the warp with the wrathful Mechanicus at her heels. When the riptides at the edge of the great eye had caught her, he had steered her through the storms. Very well, he said, and she could feel the fatigue bleeding from him into the mind impulse link. Thank you, she said. Egeon did not reply, but she felt his psyche connecting to the controls that he would use to guide the ship when it was in the warp. Somewhere out in the world of flesh and air she took a breath. Weapons, shields, and engines waited, ready for her will to guide them. Her forge fathers had made the Titan child as a warship, and she now shuddered with anticipation. The power built, held in check by her will alone. She spent an instant watching the harrowing within her, the slavers and the techrites scrabbling at her systems. In the void the emissary vessel held station, a spear shape of red iron. The blood crescent flanked her, so close she could feel the ragged output of its reactors like hot breath on her skin. Burn, she thought, and the thought became reality. Lines of plasma spat from her flank. She felt its release like air, screaming from her lungs. She howled her anger into the void. Blast doors shut throughout the hull, sealing the harrowing and their slaves into holds and corridors. Her engines lit in eruptions of glowing gas. The plasma hit the emissary ship's shields in a wash of blue-hot energy. The blood crescent remained immobile as if shocked to dumb stillness. Carmenta released the signal she had prepared. It was an order screamed in simple code. We are betrayed, it said. For an instant after there was no response, she wondered if the harrowing on board the blood crescent had seen through the lie. Then the blood crescent began to fire, its batteries roaring at the emissary ship. The Titan child was already moving, sliding away from the blood crescent. The plasma ducts inside her vented, spewing gas into the chambers and spaces holding the harrowing. Part of her mind watched them die, screaming within their melting armor. The harrowing engine sears that were interfering with her systems died as one. Lightning whipped through them from her machinery, fusing bionics and cooking flesh. She felt joy at the deaths. The emissary ship came around, ramming through the debris which spilled from its collapsing shields. The blood crescent pushed forwards, a scattered wave of torpedoes spitting from its prow. The Titan child began to curve behind the blood crescent whilst still firing on the emissary ship. Carmenta watched as the blood crescent's torpedoes hit the emissary ship in a line across its flank. The red iron hull twisted and bulged with explosions. It began to list, its course an uncontrolled spiral. The blood crescent shed assault pods and boarding craft in a growing swarm. The Titan child continued to fire on the listing emissary ship until it was sliding past the blood crescent's engines. Carmenta switched fire with a thought. The rolling broadside collapsed the shield envelope over the blood crescent's engines, and her turbo lasers lanced into the engine vents. For a moment the blood crescent slid on, and then fire bloomed along the back third of its hull. It went into a spiral, shouting surprise and rage at the Titan child. Carmenta was not listening. The rush of plasma filled her senses as the Titan child boosted away. Once the battle was a speck of fading energy against the stars, she activated her warp engines. As the psychic energies embraced the Titan child, she allowed her focus to weaken. She felt Egeon take control of their course, and let her thoughts become the dreaming hum of jelly fields and life support systems. She was running again, but she was free. and that was enough.